If we do something, it should be something that works. And the struggle up to this point has been that most of the proposals that have been offered would not have prevented not just yesterday's tragedy, but any of those in recent history. And I'm going to say now what I'm going to really emphasize at the end: just because these proposals would not have prevented these does not mean that we therefore just raise our hands and say, therefore there's nothing that we can do. It is a tough issue because it is part of the reason why it is so hard to prevent these. Is because if someone decides that they are going to take it upon themselves to kill people, whether it's a political assassination of one person or the mass killing of many, if one person decides to do it and they're committed to that task, it is a very difficult thing to stop. But that, again, does not mean that we should not try to prevent as many of them as we can. Perhaps the answer on how to prevent them begins by asking ourselves, what do these things have in common? They have two things in common. The first is that every single one of them was premeditated and planned. None of these shootings were an act of passion where someone got up in the morning, was upset, and decided to do something out of rage. They all involved careful planning and premeditation. They deliberately took steps to get the guns, the weapons, the ammunition that they needed. In many cases, they carefully studied the outline of the target which they were going to go after. They specifically planned soft targets. There's evidence of that in this case. And they planned to maximize the loss of life. They acquired the weapon that they needed, and they used tactics that they needed to kill as many people as they could. By the way, because of that premeditation and planning is one of the reasons why these laws that have been proposed wouldn't have prevented them. Because when someone is planning and premeditating an attack, they will figure out a way to evade those laws or, quite frankly, to comply with them in order to get around it. That may be an argument for new laws of a different kind, but it's what makes it hard, though not impossible. The second thing they have in common is that almost all of these attacks were preceded by clear signs of what was to come. A cursory review this morning of just a handful of the recent cases points that out. We're all familiar with the loss of life of over 20 people at a Texas church not long ago. And this is a case of a killer whose wife said that he tried to kill her, an individual who was arrested and convicted for domestic violence, which was unfortunately never reported to the background check system, an individual who escaped a mental health facility, who was caught sneaking guns onto an Air Force base while on active duty, who was discharged from the military for bad conduct, who had social media posts that bragged about buying dogs to shoot them and actually expressed admiration for the South Carolina killer in that church killing a few years ago, an individual who was actually charged with animal mistreatment just a few years earlier. In Sandy Hook, we know that the killer had a spreadsheet with details of the previous school shootings. There was also an individual whose mental state was rapidly deteriorating to the point where they spoke to no one but his mother, who he ultimately killed before carrying out that horrific massacre, but someone who was isolated in a room all day, largely playing video games. In the Pulse attack, which was precipitated and inspired by an adherence to a jihadist ideology, as Senator Nelson's already pointed out, this individual not once but twice had been on the radar screen of the FBI, and both times had been cleared. They interviewed him, they asked him questions. He didn't meet the standard for staying on the list, and he came off. We are still learning facts about yesterday's killer. Unlike these others, we may learn more because he was apprehended alive, and authorities have had an opportunity to question him, and that will continue. But here's what we know. We know that he was expelled from school for behavior that the administrators thought was dangerous. We know that from press accounts now, both teachers and students did not act surprised that he was the assailant. In fact, many of them said that there was a running joke, obviously not a joke anymore, that one day he would do something like this. We know that the media and others have discovered social media posts, which are, in hindsight, deeply disturbing as they point to an glorification of gun violence and murder and animal cruelty even, apparently. We saw reports this morning of a post on YouTube a year ago where he posted that he wanted to be a school shooter. This was alerted to the FBI, who had followed up, by the way, in an interview with that person who alerted them. They all have this premeditation in common, and we sit here in hindsight and see all of these little points and say, taken together, those are warning signs. The problem is they're not taken together, because the people who might have known about him being expelled may not have known about the social media posts. And the people who knew about the social media posts may not have known about what he wrote on YouTube. And the people who knew about the YouTube may not have known about the fact that the police have been called several times for different reasons and so forth. And so, hence the challenge for why it's so hard to find something that works. And there are a lot of proposals. And I'll share the ones because I've heard them before and I hear them today, and I'm not diminishing them. I don't want this to be taken as, because it won't work, I don't even want to hear your argument. I understand, I really do. You read in the newspaper that they used a certain kind of gun, and therefore, let's make it harder to get those kinds of guns. I don't have some sort of de facto religious objection to that or some ideological commitment to that per se. There's all kinds of guns that are outlawed and weaponry that's outlawed and or a special category. The problem is we did that once, and it didn't work for a lot of reasons. One of them is there's already millions of these in the street. And those things, they last 100 years. And so you could pass a law that makes it hard to get this kind of gun in a new condition. But you're going to struggle to keep it out of the hands of someone who's decided that's what they want to use, because there's so many of them out there already that would be grandfathered in. You can do a background check. The truth is, in almost all these cases I cited, the individual either erroneously passed a background check or would have passed it or did. Again, even if they couldn't pass the background check, then they could buy them the way MS-13 does and other gangs and other street elements do from the black market. Again, not because we shouldn't have the background check. I'm just trying to be clear and honest here. If someone's decided I'm going to commit this crime, they'll find a way to get the gun to do it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have a law that makes it harder. It just means understand, to be honest. It isn't going to stop this from happening. You could still pass the law, per se, but you're still going to have these horrible attacks. And that's why I do think that in some circles it isn't fair or right to create this impression that somehow this attack happened yesterday because there's some law out there that we could have passed to prevent it. For if there was such a law that could have prevented yesterday, I think a lot of people would have supported it. But I also want to be honest to people who share my point of view on these issues. I think it's also wrong to say that there's nothing we can do. And I would admit that perhaps even I, in the past, in the way I've addressed this issue or spoken about it, may have come off as dismissive, with the argument that since none of these laws would have worked, there's just nothing we can do, and we'll just have to deal with it. Just because I don't have a quick or easy answer for how to prevent these doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation to try and find one. And by finding one, I don't mean a quick and easy answer. I mean an answer that would work. When I took office here, I swore to uphold the Constitution of the United States, every element of it. I didn't write the Constitution, but I agree with it and I support it. The Second Amendment's in the Constitution. And you can debate what the outlines of the Second Amendment are or how far it goes, but it's in there. And I happen to support it. And I happen to oftentimes point to the Second Amendment and say it's the Second Amendment, right after free speech, which tells you how important it was to those who wrote those words. I still believe every bit of that. But I also recognize that if it's fair to say that the Second Amendment is so important, and I want to reiterate it is, because of how high up it is in the ranking from first to second, it's the second one, then I have to recognize that there's a part of the Constitution that was written even before the Second Amendment. And it's the preamble. And that preamble lays out why we have a Constitution, and ultimately why we have a government. And in it, it says that two of the reasons why we have a government, and therefore two of the reasons why we have a Senate, is to ensure domestic tranquility and to promote the general welfare. And these school shootings and mass shootings and murders that we are seeing now on an accelerated pace, these things are by definition a threat to our domestic tranquility and a threat to our general welfare.